I ran into an old family friend the other day, a veteran who served back in the late 80s. We were just catching up, but somehow the news about Venezuela came up. His entire demeanor changed. He got this decisive look. It's just like Panama, he said, and he snapped his fingers. It's a narco-state. You go in, you cut the head off the snake, you come home. Clean. He talked about Operation Just Cause in 1989 with this real, almost fond nostalgia, like he was describing a perfectly executed football play. He kept using words like surgical and decisive. To him, it was this perfect, tidy story. A clear villain, a quick operation, and a clean victory. But it was what he said next that really struck me. I asked him, but wasn't it complicated, the aftermath, the civilian cost? He just shook his head almost impatiently. That's not the point. The point is we acted, we did the job. Yeah. That absolute confidence, not in the long-term outcome, but in the act itself. That deep, satisfying belief in the clean war, the simple, righteous intervention, it felt like more than just an old memory. It felt like an instinct, a reflex. And it's a reflex I'm starting to see everywhere.
Yeah, that's incredibly telling. That pull towards the surgical strike idea, it's psychologically very strong, isn't it?
Right.
And politically, too. It really nails what we often call this imperial reflex.
Exactly.
It kind of offers policymakers this feeling of taking immediate control.
Yeah.
You know, in a world full of messy, tangled problems that take forever to solve, it feels like mastery, but without the long, hard slog.
Right, without the real commitment.
Precisely. But like you saw, that confidence in just doing something in the act itself, it often just bulldozes over any real look at what happens down the road.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, our mission for this deep dive is really to unpack that. Let's look hard at the actual track records, military interventions, covert stuff. Why does this instinct stick around when, frankly, the evidence shows it fails so often?
And then what are the real alternatives, the ones that might actually work for stability and peace in the long run?
Exactly. What does the data show us about what genuinely fosters stability?
Okay, so if we're talking about intervention as this sort of default setting in politics, we need to get a handle on the history first, right? I mean, how often are we really talking about, if the reflex is all about quick, decisive action, does the data back that up? Is it usually successful?
Well, the history, especially if you look at the Cold War, it shows an incredible amount of intervention. Staggering, but interestingly, a massive preference for doing it secretly.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, some recent analysis, it's quite revealing. Between, 1947 and 1989, they counted 64 separate covert ops trying to overthrow governments.
64.
64. And compare that to only 6 overt, boots on the ground military operations.
So 10 times more secret attempts than open ones.
Yeah, basically 10-1. Intervention was definitely the go-to move, but secrecy was the preferred way to do it.
64 times trying to change regimes in the shadows. That number alone is something else. But what was the hit rate? Did being secret actually help them get what they wanted politically?
You'd think so, but no, not really. The success rate was pretty abysmal, actually. Across all those 64 major covert actions, the chance of actually succeeding in putting their chosen new regime in power, less than 40%.
Less than 40. So it failed more than 60% of the time.
That's right. Over 3/5 of all attempts didn't achieve their main goal, which, immediately begs the question. If it fails that often, why on earth did they keep doing it? Why did the reflex persist?
Yeah, that's where it gets really fascinating, doesn't it? Because you have to assume these policymakers, they're smart people, they have access to information. Normally, if a tool fails you 60% of the time, you'd stop using it.
You would think. Yeah. But, big organizations, political leaders, they can suffer from cognitive biases, institutional inertia, right?
Yeah.
It's hard to admit that this huge apparatus you've built, say, a covert intelligence agency, might not be that effective.
Easier to keep seeing it as a tool in the toolbox that just has to be used.
Exactly, whether it worked last time or not.
Yeah.
And the failures, they weren't just quiet failures. They often blew up into massive geopolitical disaster.
That's the Bay of Pigs.
Oh, absolutely. The Bay of Pigs in '61. The goal was supposed to be this neat surgical regime change in Cuba. What happened? Total failure. It actually made Castro stronger.
And much worse?
Much worse. It directly led to the Cuban Missile Crisis. Yeah. The single closest point the world ever came to all-out nuclear war. The attempt at a clean war almost immediately sparked the ultimate dirty one.
And the ripple effects, the long-term consequences, can be even deeper. You look at Iran, 1953.
Right. The U.S. and the U.K., they backed the coup against Mossadegh, who was democratically elected, mainly because he wanted to nationalize Iran's oil.
It looked like a win at the time, right? Put the Shah back in power.
It did, in the short term.
Yeah.
But think about it. They removed a popular elected leader and installed an autocratic ruler backed by foreign powers. What did that do? It planted decades of resentment, deep resentment. The Shah's regime, often pretty repressive, propped up with American help. It created this really strong anti-American feeling in Iran. So when that system finally fell apart in the '79 revolution, that feeling, those memories of '53, they were baked into the new Islamic Republic.
And that still shapes global politics today.
Absolutely. These aren't small side effects. These are fundamental shifts in geopolitics directly caused by that intervention reflex.
Okay, so we've got this tool, covert action. It fails most of the time. It can cause huge long-term problems, yet it stayed the preferred method. And you're saying the reason for hiding it, the secrecy, was basically because of international law.
That's the core argument, yeah. It's the main constraint. After World War II, the world tried to set up some rules. The UN Charter in 1945, it wrote down this principle of non-intervention, basically. States shouldn't mess with other state sovereignty.
Got it.
And regional groups, like the Organization of American States, the OAS, they reinforced that. So once non-intervention became, actual international law, openly sending in the military became costly, politically, diplomatically.
So the law didn't stop the desire to intervene, it just forced it underground.
Exactly right. Leaders needed ways to intervene without looking like hypocrites or bullies on the world stage. They had to protect their credibility, avoid being accused of breaking the very rules they helped create.
And you can kind of see that calculation play out in which operations were open versus secret.
Yeah, look at the difference. The Dominican Republic in '65, Grenada in '83, those were big, overt invasions. But officials could try to justify them. They'd cite reasons like protecting American citizens or maybe getting some kind of backing from an international group like the OAS. It gave them a bit of legal cover, however thin.
But places like Cuba with the Bay of Pigs or Chile with the yen.
Right. In those cases, they couldn't really find or manufacture those kinds of legal loopholes. So covert action became the only path they felt was politically survivable.
And there's evidence from the archives, right, that policymakers were genuinely worried about the diplomatic fallout of breaking the rules openly.
Oh, definitely. The constraints were real, even at the very top. You can find quotes from President Eisenhower back in 1960, really wrestling with the Castro problem. He basically complained that if it weren't for the OAS and how much they hated intervention, the U.S. would already be building up forces at Guantanamo to go after Castro overtly.
They felt genuinely blocked by the rules.
They did. And you had officials like Assistant Secretary Thomas Mann warning that overt intervention in Latin America would just trash the U.S.'s moral standing in the region. He called the potential impact on leadership catastrophic. So keeping that moral high ground, or the appearance of it, often trumped going for a quick, open military win.
But then shifting to covert action brings its own set of issues, like this idea of deniability, which often seemed more like a fantasy.
Yeah, the delusion of control. They chased technical deniability even when plausible deniability was, frankly, a joke.
What do you mean technical versus plausible?
Well, plausible means it's believable you weren't involved. Technical just means you can formally deny state involvement, even if everyone kind of knows. Like the Bay of Pigs, the plans were practically an open secret beforehand.
No, it was more about having an official fig leaf.
Exactly. It was a performance. But the irony is, insisting on that technical deniability often pushed them into riskier actions. And the whole setup has built-in problems.
Like what?
Well, covert ops get less scrutiny beforehand because secrecy limits who can vet them. Interveners might take bigger risks because they think the fallout will be less, they can deny it. And, crucially, you have to hand over the actual doing of it to local groups.
Who have their own agendas.
Totally. Often unreliable actors with their own goals, their own rivalries. So you end up with less control, not more. More chaos potential.
Which brings us pretty much up to date. The Cold War rationale for intervention is gone, but the reflex itself seems to have found a new justification. The narco-state.
Ah, yes, the narco-state template. It's kind of the perfect modern enemy for that old reflex, isn't it? Whether it's Noriega back in '89, or you hear the rhetoric about Maduro in Venezuela today.
Why is it so perfect?
Think about it. It ticks all the boxes. It's morally indefensible. Nobody likes drug trafficking.
True.
It seems strategically manageable. You're not usually picking a fight with a major power. And it's often geographically convenient. It gives you that nice, simple story your friend mentioned. Chaos coming from the tropics, order restored by decisive, clean force.
And politically, it seems like a winner. A leader can look tough, decisive, without a huge political cost.
Absolutely. What are the other options? A big, long war. politically disastrous, direct confrontation with, say, China or Russia. Hugely risky, economically and militarily.
Right.
But going after a supposed narco-state in a smaller country, militarily, it's often relatively easy. Diplomatically, you might even get praised. And symbolically, it's potent. It delivers that image of strength, of restoring order, dominance even.
All without the messiness of a long conflict or actual nation building.
Precisely. It's intervention as spectacle. It prioritizes the image of power over actually defining or achieving clear long-term stability. The clean war fantasy lives on.
But the big problem with that fantasy, as we saw even when massive resources were poured in, like in Vietnam, is that the basic idea of forcing compliance often just doesn't work. It can spectacularly backfire.
Yeah, Vietnam is such a critical, devastating case study for this whole reflex. The scale of resources the U.S. poured in was just unbelievable. U.S. spending actually topped the war on poverty budget by like 17 times.
Wow, 17 times.
Yeah. So it wasn't a lack of trying or lack of resources. The problem was deeper in the fundamental strategy itself.
And there were basically two competing ideas about how to actually win, right? Two completely different philosophies clashing within the U.S. effort.
That's right. You had two main schools of thought. The dominant one, often pushed by the Army and people like Defense Secretary McNamara, was all about overwhelming firepower.
The top-down approach.
Exactly. Top-down coercion. The idea was basically to crush the insurgents by showing them who's boss through sheer force. Yeah. There was that infamous saying,
"Get the people by the balls and their hearts and minds will follow."
Right. Brutal, but it captures the mindset. Some strategists literally talk about a ruthless projection of government power. They even dropped leaflets warning villagers about death from the sky. The plan was to compel obedience through fear.
Okay, so that's one side. What was the alternative?
The alternative was the hearts and minds strategy. This was championed more by the U.S. Marine Corps, the USMC.
And their approach was bottom up.
Completely bottom up. They focused on positive things, incentives, helping communities, civic action, really embedding with local people. The goal wasn't just to kill insurgents, but to get rid of the reasons people might support them in the first place.
So development and cooperation, not just force.
Right. Their own manuals talked about aiming for decisive results with the least application of force and focusing on the social, economic, and political development of the people. Very different philosophy.
So how do we know which one actually worked better? This is where some really clever research comes in, using this thing called the Hamlet Evaluation System, right? HES.
Yes. This is fascinating. The HES was this incredibly detailed system the military used back then to rate how secure hundreds of small villages or hamlets were week by week.
Okay.
But the crucial part for researchers later was how the final security score was calculated. It used this complex formula, a Bayesian algorithm, that involved rounding numbers up or down at certain thresholds.
Wait, hang on. Are you saying that because of how they rounded the scores, some villages just barely missed getting bombed, while others just barely qualified, like a random fluke?
That's exactly it. It created what researchers call a regression discontinuity. Hamlets, whose raw score was just below a rounding point, were significantly more likely to get bombed than hamlets whose score was just above it, even though they were otherwise almost identical in terms of conditions on the ground.
So it effectively created a natural experiment decades later. They could compare the bombed villages to the almost identical unbombed ones and see the real impact of the bombing itself.
Precisely. It allows you to isolate the causal effect of the bombing, separating it from all the other chaos of the war.
And the results? What did overwhelming firepower actually achieve?
Well, it was terrifyingly clear. The bombing didn't crush the insurgency, it fed it. It acted like a recruitment drive for the Viet Cong.
Really? It made things worse.
Significantly worse. The data showed that going from no bombing strikes to the average level of bombing in the sample increased the probability of a local Viet Cong guerrilla squad popping up by 27 percentage points.
Wow.
And it also boosted the activity of the VC's political wing, and the guys doing recruitment, propaganda, taxes by 25 percentage points. The bombing was literally creating the conditions for the insurgency to thrive.
That's incredible. The very strategy meant to destroy the enemy was actually helping them grow. Why couldn't policymakers see that connection at the time?
Well, think about what the military was measuring. They were focused on visible things. Enemy killed, structures destroyed, easy numbers to report up the chain.
Right. Body counts.
Exactly. They weren't measuring the invisible stuff nearly as well. Things like local resentment, trust in the government, the strength of local institutions. But the bombing was systematically destroying those things.
How so?
The research showed bombing reduced the chances of all the village committee jobs being filled by 21 percentage points. It cut local tax collection by 25%.
So the actual government on the ground just couldn't function.
Right. If you can't fill basic admin jobs or collect taxes, you have no capacity to govern. It leaves a vacuum. And who fills that vacuum?
The insurgents.
Exactly. And it hit the social fabric, too. Bombing reduced access to primary schools by 16 percentage points. Participation in non-communist local groups dropped by 13 points. You ended up with a population that was less educated, less organized, and deeply alienated from the government dropping the bombs.
Creating more potential recruits?
And the tragic irony. The military saw the security getting worse, so their response was more military operations later on, more troops, more sweeps. It created this vicious cycle of violence, fueled by the initial bombing itself.
This research also let you compare the two big strategies directly, right? The Army's firepower approach versus the Marines' hearts and minds, based on who controlled which region.
Yeah, it created a kind of natural experiment between different military regions. Region I is mostly the USMC, Region 2 is mostly the Army. The Army went heavy on the big search and destroy missions, lots of indiscriminate fire to clear areas.
And the Marines?
The Marines focused more on smaller units, setting up strong local bases, sticking around, providing security, and doing lots of civic action, building schools, clinics, that sort of thing. Yeah. Continuous engagement.
And the results clearly favored one approach.
Oh, significantly. The USMC region, the Hearts and Minds region, showed much better outcomes. They actually invested in public goods, things people needed. Education access was 24 points higher. Healthcare access a massive 56 points higher compared to the Army region.
And did that translate into less violence?
It did. The Marine region consistently had fewer Viet Cong attacks, lower overall VC presence.
Okay, that's the security outcome. What about the actual hearts and minds? Did people feel differently?
Yes, and we actually have data on that too from surveys done during the war. People in the USMC region reported much more positive views of both the U.S. forces and the South Vietnamese government.
They felt safer, maybe saw some benefits.
Exactly. They felt safer, they saw tangible improvements in their lives, and they were less likely to see the Americans and the government as just the source of their suffering. It's pretty strong empirical proof that the bottom-up cooperative development-focused approach was way more effective at achieving stability than just unleashing overwhelming force. Yeah. The coercive reflex backfired.
So the Vietnam data really hammers home how counterproductive that coercive reflex can be. But if we look at more recent interventions, it seems like that illusion of the clean war just keeps causing damage, shattering whole countries and leaving these deep, long-lasting wounds. It goes way beyond just counting casualties.
Yeah, we really need to reckon with the long-term structural damage. The reflex is always about speed and force, right?
Yeah.
Get in, get it done. But the intervening powers almost never stick around for the decades of patient rebuilding needed to replace the structures they just broke. It makes me think of this account from Khalid. He was a history teacher in Tripoli, in Libya. He lived through the 2011 NATO intervention and everything that came after.
What was his perspective on the true cost?
He talked about how quickly the idea of a unified Libya just dissolved. He described the intervention like pulling out a single crucial support beam and the whole house just collapsing inward.
Wow.
NATO succeeded in removing the Gaddafi regime, sure, but he said they completely failed to help rebuild the foundations, the national army, the government ministries, the economy, and the result wasn't just civil war. It was this resurgence of old regional and tribal divisions. The center just couldn't hold anymore.
So instead of bringing stability, breaking the old structure created a vacuum that just sucked in more conflict and interference?
Precisely. Khalid's point, ultimately, was that the outside powers basically denied Libya the chance to find its own path to peace, however messy. He argued that respecting sovereignty, letting a country manage its own affairs, even if it means letting them struggle and fail sometimes, that's crucial. Because that internal resilience, that ability to adapt and build, it can only grow if it's not constantly being manipulated by outsiders pushing their own agendas. That loss of internal capacity, he felt, was the deepest wound of all.
That risk, the risk of shattering countries' structures, maybe that's why policymakers sometimes pivot to things like sanctions, that they see it as less destructive, more surgical coercion, right? But your work shows that sanctions can be just another form of hard power with a really devastating human cost.
Absolutely. It's still coercion, just using economic weapons instead of military ones. And the impact, it often lands hardest on ordinary people, the most vulnerable. Not necessarily the leaders they're supposedly targeting. I think about the experience of Dr. Elena. She's an oncologist in Caracas, Venezuela, and she saw firsthand what happened during the period of really intense international sanctions.
Can you share a bit about what she described? It's easy to talk about supply chains, but what did that actually mean for her patients?
She described it as making treatment almost impossible. Sanctions often target a country's main source of income in Venezuela, that's oil. That's where they get the foreign currency to buy essential things from abroad, like medicine.
Okay.
So Dr. Lena talked about these agonizing choices, having to decide which cancer patients got the tiny amount of chemotherapy drugs left. Her staff were running around desperately trying to find basic spare parts for essential equipment, like MRI machines or radiation therapy machines, because they couldn't import them.
So the pressure meant to hurt the regime ended up crippling the health system for everyone.
Systematically, it destroyed the country's economic resilience and its ability to care for its own citizens, condemning ordinary people to immense suffering and, frankly, preventable deaths.
Which really highlights the problem with sanctions as just a punishment tool, doesn't it? It causes widespread pain, maybe increases discontent, but that rarely leads neatly to the kind of positive change the interveners claim to want.
Exactly. You always have to ask, is this effective compared to the alternatives? Instead of just crippling the economy and hurting the population, maybe the focus should be on, say, comprehensive economic development strategies or infrastructure partnerships, things specifically aimed at strengthening public health or energy or education.
Building capacity instead of destroying it.
Right. Cooperative approaches that build trust and resilience rather than just trying to break things. That seems like a more sustainable path to stability.
And then the final piece of this tragic puzzle is when international law just gets thrown out the window entirely. You end up with multiple countries intervening unilaterally, creating total chaos. Syria seems like the prime example of that.
Oh, Syria is the absolute nightmare scenario of what happens when the basic rules of non-intervention collapse. I remember talking to a relief worker who was there, and he described this. Just total free-for-all of competing external powers. He said any talk of international law felt like an abstract joke because everyone was just doing whatever they wanted, backing their own proxies.
And for the people living there, what did that mean?
It meant endless, intractable war. This relief worker talked about one town changing hands between 3 different heavily armed groups in just 1 year. And 2 of those groups were directly backed by different foreign countries who were essentially fighting each other through these local proxies.
So the outside powers weren't bringing peace, they were bringing
more guns and more chaos, as he put it. They turned Syria into this horrific proxy battleground. It's a devastating illustration of why we need strong multilateral institutions, why we need adherence to international law. Without that shared framework, unilateral actions just create chaos, development becomes impossible, and the instability just feeds on itself indefinitely.
Okay, so if that coercive reflex, whether it's military force, covert ops, or even harsh economic sanctions, if it's so often self-defeating and ideally constrained by international law anyway, what should we be looking at instead? What's the spectrum of constructive, legitimate ways to exert influence globally?
Well, I think we have to fundamentally broaden our idea of what power even means in international relations. We need to move beyond that simple, ingrained idea that power just equals military force.
Right.
And this is where the framework developed by Joseph Nye is really helpful. He breaks power down into 3 main types.
We've talked a lot about hard power. That's the obvious one, the coercion toolbox.
Exactly. Hard power is using those tangible things, tanks, bombs, sanctions, tariffs, to force another country to do something it doesn't want to do. This is the kind of power that the theory of realism really focuses on. Realists tend to see international politics as fundamentally a struggle for power.
But there's a subtle difference within realism, isn't there, between traditional realism and neorealism, how they see the role of hard power.
Yeah, that's a key distinction. Traditional realism often sees power almost as the end goal itself. States just want more power. Neorealism, though, is a bit more nuanced. It sees power primarily as a means to achieve the ultimate goal, which is security and survival in a world without a global government, an anarchic system.
But either way, hard power is king for realists.
Pretty much. It's the essential tool for survival in their view, and that framework really underpins that intervention reflex we've been talking about.
Okay, so that's hard power. What's the opposite end of the spectrum? Soft power.
Right. Soft power is completely different. It's about getting other countries to want what you want, influencing them through attraction and persuasion, not force or payment.
How does that work in practice?
It relies on intangible things. Your culture, your political values, your foreign policies, if others see them as legitimate, diplomacy, educational exchanges, media influence, trade partnerships. It's about making your way seem appealing. This is the kind of power that the liberalism school of thought emphasizes.
And liberals are more optimistic about cooperation, right? They don't think military force is always the answer.
Exactly. Liberals critique that kind of deterministic view of power you find in realism. They believe cooperation between states, international organizations, economic interdependence, these things can reduce the effects of anarchy and make war less likely.
So for them, economic ties might be more powerful than military might.
Often, yes. They argue that economic power is hugely significant and that states have better ways than fighting, like building strong trade relationships to ensure their long-term security. Soft power, building influence through attraction, is crucial for liberals.
But in the real world, it's rarely just one or the other, is it? Especially in really complex situations. That brings us to Nye's third concept, smart power.
Exactly. Smart power is about recognizing that you probably need a mix. It's the strategy of combining hard and soft power tools, using the strengths of each in a coordinated way to achieve your goals more effectively.
When did this idea really take hold?
It got a lot of attention during the U.S. involvement in Afghanistan. The argument was that just military force wasn't enough. You needed to integrate it seamlessly with diplomacy, economic aid, development projects. The idea is to use your entire toolkit, not just the hammer, to achieve sustainable outcomes, not just quick military wins.
And looking around the world, it seems like governments have implemented nation-building efforts.
Absolutely. The sheer number is striking. Research shows there have been over 300 instances in just the last 50 years or so where multiple countries have worked together, providing both military and economic aid to a country trying to recover from conflict.
So these hybrid efforts suggest a realization that stability needs more than just military dominance.
It definitely does. It's an implicit nod to the kind of research we were just discussing, like the Vietnam findings, showing that just bombing actually increased the insurgency. It acknowledges that you need massive economic support, development aid, institution building alongside any security measures. Nation building, when it's done well multilaterally with a long-term view, is essentially an attempt to practice smart power. It tries to blend security with development to actually help the recipient country grow and stabilize. So if we try to pull all these threads together, the empirical data, whether it's the really detailed quantitative work from Vietnam or the more recent painful lessons we see in places like Libya, Venezuela, Syria, it all points to a pretty clear conclusion, I think, that the instinctive resort to the imperial reflex, using overwhelming force or unilateral coercion like sanctions, it's profoundly destabilizing in the long run. It consistently seems to fuel insurgency, undermine the local government's ability to function, and tear apart the social connections needed for any kind of lasting peace. That idea of the clean war your friend mentioned, it's not just a myth, it's actually a counterproductive way to approach policy.
And bringing it back to where we started, with international law. The fact that powerful countries felt they had to use covert action sometimes, like with the Bay of Pigs, even when maybe they wanted to just invade, that shows the rules mattered, right? That non-intervention principle from 1945 actually did constrain them, at least somewhat.
It did act as a constraint, even if imperfect. It raised the political cost of just outright grabbing territory or overthrowing governments openly.
But if that rules-based system keeps getting weaker, if countries feel more free to ignore it,
then the cost of overt intervention goes down. And that imperial reflex can become openly normalized again, not even bothering with a fig leaf of covert action, which makes understanding and committing to the alternatives, the constructive, non-coercive approaches, the soft power tools, the sustained focus on economic development and genuine multilateral cooperation, well, that makes that more urgent and more critical than ever before.